This is our 50th session of our group. Okay, there are a couple of little preliminaries that I wanted to read to you first because I haven't read them, I realized, and they're sort of fundamental to everything we're talking about. And so this is from The New God Image by Edward Edinger. And Edinger had a few comments in his introduction that I thought would be interesting, because what we're talking about is literally the evolution of the human psyche. And what Jung and Edinger did was they had all these experiences with analyses, right? And so then they started to go back and look at art and literature and music and everything that had come out of the human psyche as far back as they could go. Especially Jung did this. And so the result of that was he was able to interpret human history in the context of the evolution of the psyche. Okay, and I was a history major, and we got a lot of dates, and this is why King so and so went to war with King so and so, and this was the ramifications of the Civil War and that sort of stuff, right? And so it was all back and forth, but nobody really explained it in this way. And when you think of it in this way, then you say, oh my God, if we could bootstrap ourselves to understand what's going on, then we can interpret things like the Las Vegas shooting last night in very different ways. Okay, so what he said was, wow, this is loud in here tonight. But amazingly, this thing has an awesome microphone. I don't know why, but
I brought a deck of cards when I leave.
Could do that. But I'll just read this preliminary stuff to you, and then we can get our discussion going later. But okay, the history of Western man can be viewed as a history of its God images, the primary formulations of how mankind orients itself to the basic questions of life, its mysteries. It was Jung's phenomenological discovery that the Western God image has undergone a whole series of transformations in the course of its evolutionary and historical development, and that we are now on the verge of another such evolutionary leap in the development of the God image. We are right on the verge of witnessing the birth of a new God image as a result of Jung's work. It is an idea Jung developed most explicitly in his book Answer to Job. Okay, and
we're operating on a shoestring.
Well, so we were talking earlier about how religion just isn't grabbing people much anymore. I mean, the theologians put themselves in between God and the people, so the people no longer have these numinous experiences. And what they did was they replaced Mary with the church, and so we'll interpret for you what God has to say, right? And the people said, "Screw you! We're gonna pray to the Virgin." And that's exactly what Edinger says here. Okay, so the very first sentence of Answer to Job reads as follows: The book of Job is a landmark in the long evolutionary pathway of a divine drama. To be specific, Jung is explicitly stating that the development of the God image is not just a cultural process, but is also an evolutionary process, something which has a biological substrate. Okay. And, that's what makes this discussion about the Buddha images being similar to the Ezekiel images and so on. The remarkable idea in the sentence is the phrase divine drama, referring to a dynamic process. The God image is not a static entity. The archetype of the God image, what we live by, whether we know it or not, is part of a dynamic process. It means that in the course of the evolution of the human species and in the historical cultural development of the human species, the God image is a living entity, a living process that moves, that unfolds, that develops and undergoes transformations. That transformation process is also evident. That transformation process is also evident if one makes a historical examination of the facts of the collective psyche. The God image is a synonym for the self in Jungian terms. The term God image should not be confused with the term God. To speak of the God image asserts nothing about God. As Jung states, no man can know God. Knowing means seeing a thing in such a way that all can know it. And for me, it means absolutely nothing if I profess a knowledge which I alone possess. It says more specifically, the term God image is synonymous with a particular aspect of the self, what would be called the collective self. In other words, it is a transpersonal center shared by a whole body of humanity and may have more than an individual reference. And then he gives a diagram which I'll pass around to you in a bit. But basically it's got a big circle, and in 4 different axes the very small ego is sneaking up out of the big circle, but the ego is partially surrounded by a personal self also. So it's got the big self that is the collective unconscious, maybe of our group, but I would argue that today it's becoming international, and if it wasn't already across humanity, it certainly is now, although with these images that we've seen of the Ezekiel vision and Buddha, these are images that came from 500 years before Christ. So it's a process that's been going on a long time. Okay, so then he says, all God images are modes of expression of humanity's experience and understanding of the autonomous psyche, a very modern formulation. Such a formulation was not psychologically possible before Jung, but now we can understand all manifestations of the God image as descriptive stages of humanity's experience of the autonomous aspect of the psyche. There is evidence to indicate that the stages of psychological development do tend to go through these historically represented stations. Commonplace in embryology is the phrase ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. It's a mouthful. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, meaning the development of the individual recapitulates the development of the species. For example, a human embryo in its early development has gill slits, anatomical structures found in the fish. Vestiges of evolutionary development are repeated in the human embryo in the course of its own embryological development. There is reason to believe that something similar happens in the development of the psyche, Looking back on one's own psychological history, it is not so hard to see that in oneself. All those stages do exist, however, in the maximally integrated person. In someone like Jung, they are integrated in a unified way. They are experienced not so much as separate compartments, but as a harmonic whole. Okay, so then he goes into the descriptions of the stages of evolution, of religious evolutionary development, which I think we talked about before. So 3 steps are involved in understanding what Jung is talking about in his material concerning the new God image. The first step is the ability to perceive the new God image, which requires that one master the epistemological premises that enable one to recognize the reality of the psyche. Okay, so that means the epistemological means the way we gain the knowledge of the knowledge of the reality of the psyche. Okay? And the second step then follows from the seeing of the new God image Jung is talking about. He is not imposing it by fiat. Rather, he is teaching us how to perceive for ourselves what he is talking about. It is a matter of perceiving for yourself. Then the third step, after seeing the reality of this new God image as it lives itself out in one's own individual psychology, as well as in the psychology of the collective, is an awareness of what the individual can do to help the process of transformation of this God image. That is what is meant by the process of continuing incarnation. Okay, that's what he's talking about. So, anyway, I'll pass this around. This is the diagram. Oh, let me just show it here first. Okay, so this is the diagram that Dr. Edinger was talking about. And if you look in this book, The New God Image by Edward Edinger, you can see it.